Today is the 28th day of the month of Teves. We're in the middle of chapter 47, discussing wine that was touched by a non-Jew. Today we're doing paragraph 8 through the end of the chapter, paragraph 22. I should have mentioned this in the beginning of the chapter, but many of these halachas, many of these paragraphs aren't so relevant for us nowadays because we buy wine in the store and it has a kosher symbol on it and it says mavushal, cooked. So all these things that we're talking about aren't relevant about the wine vat, etc. If anybody's involved in wine production, however, then these would all be very relevant. So paragraph 8. One should make sure to not have a non-Jew remove the peels or the seeds from a wine press, even after the wine had been already drawn out of it, because the concern there'll still be some moisture left on the peels and the seeds, and if that moisture ends up in wine, then it could end up making a problem for the entire wine. Paragraph 9. Nowadays, when we buy wine in the store, then we just drink the wine straight. But it used to be in the times of the Talmud that the wine that they had was extremely, extremely heavy wine, and in order to be able to drink it, it would be diluted. So if you have a non-Jew diluting the wine, or if you have a non-Jew pouring water into wine, if their intention was to dilute the wine, then even though they didn't necessarily touch the wine, because they're involved in processing the wine, there's a concern maybe they touched it by accident, or they touched it you didn't notice, and therefore that wine would not be kosher. If we're not sure of the reason that they put the water into the wine, then it would still be kosher. Paragraph 10. If you have vinegar, wine that became vinegar, went sour, if that vinegar is so bad that it starts like bubbling, that's how strong vinegar it was, and at that point it loses any status of wine it might have. If a non-Jew touches it, no problem. However, if it hasn't yet reached that stage of where it was bubbling, then it would be a problem if a non-Jew touched it. Now, I want to point out that this is why vinegar, even though you wouldn't think it's such a big deal, vinegar could be a very kosher-sensitive product because if it's made out of wine, or if it has a wine base of that sort, then it would have a lot of these restrictions that we're talking about. Paragraph 11. If you have wine that a non-Jew touched and you turn that wine into brandy, then that wine wouldn't be kosher because it came from wine that wasn't kosher. However, if you have kosher wine, you turn it into brandy, and now a non-Jew touches it, it wouldn't render it not kosher because at this point it doesn't have a status of wine anymore, it has a status of brandy, so it's not a problem. Paragraph 12. I'm not familiar with this, but apparently there's something called tartar, which is the residue that accumulates in the wall of wine barrels, and that residue is used in baking powder or medicine. Now this tartar might come from a barrel of wine which a non-Jew touched, so the wine wasn't kosher. Does that render this tartar also not kosher? Says the Kitzur Aruch, that's not a problem, that tartar is still fine. Paragraph 13. Let's say a non-Jew touches wine or removes a bottle of wine which is not cooked. Again, if it's cooked, all these issues aren't issues anymore if it's mavushal. But let's say it's not mavushal and you have a non-Jewish waiter pouring wine, but they're wearing gloves. Do we say the gloves means that they're not holding it because of separation? They're not touching it, they're not involved in it. It's the gloves that are doing it. They're wearing the gloves. Then it says, no, we don't look at a glove as a separation. However, if they would use a stick and they took a stick and they mixed up the wine, something of that sort, that might be, so if that happens, then consult with halachic authority. Paragraph 14. Because of all these restrictions, all these concerns that wine has, because wine is could so easily become not kosher, then if you're shipping wine and you don't have somebody Jewish washing the wine the whole time, you're shipping it like we talked about in last chapter, you're shipping it with a non-Jew, or if somebody doesn't keep kosher, so you have to make sure that the wine, that the container is sealed with 2 seals to ensure that it wasn't tampered with, that nothing else is added to it or exchanged with it, etc., and that's still kosher wine. When the receiver gets it, he sees those 2 seals, he knows this wine is still kosher, it's not a problem. However, if there aren't 2 seals on it, that could be a big kosher problem, and make sure to speak to a rabbi if you get a nice shipment of wine that you want to drink and it's not sealed properly. Paragraph 15. Let's say a non-Jew doesn't touch the wine, but a non-Jew owns the wine press or the wine plant. So that could also create issues. Let's say you have a non-Jewish owned wine plant, but Jewish managers, Jewish workers, so no non-Jews are touching it. This still could be an issue, and therefore before working in such a place or managing such a place, make sure to speak to a competent halachic authority. Paragraph 16. Let's say you have non-kosher wine, and you pour it into your cup to drink, and then you realize, oh my goodness, this wine isn't kosher. Is your cup now not kosher? Has your cup been contaminated? You have to worry about kosherizing your cup. So as long as the wine didn't stay in there for 24 hours, then generally be fine, as long as the glass that was in, the cup that was in, was made out of wood, glass, stone, metal. If you have some sort of leather pouch that it was in, that's fine. It's not a problem. You just rinse it off. You scrub it down, and it's totally fine as long as wine wasn't in there for 24 hours. Once it gets to 24 hours, then this cup or this utensil would have to be kosherized. If this cup or this utensil is made out of earthenware, porcelain, etc., then in that scenario, because earthenware is usually porous, there's a concern that wine got into the walls of the cup or the utensil or the bowl or whatever it is, the pitcher, and then that could be a real cautious concern. So make sure to speak to a competent halachic authority about how to deal with that. Paragraph 17. Now let's say we're not talking about a glass or a cup. Let's say we're talking about some sort of vat or some sort of storage container, something that you store wine in. Now it has to be something that you store wine in for at least 3 days, generally speaking. So if wine ends up in that container, even not for 3 days, just for a short period of time, we're talking about non-kosher wine, then in that scenario, it does have to undergo a koshering process. How do you kosher it? It's an unusual way of koshering, but the way it works is the following. You clean it out, you then put in water, fill it up with water until it overflows. You can even use cold water for this. Let that water sit in there for 24 hours, pour it out, again, put in a second, fill it up a second time with water, let that water sit there for 24 hours, and you do it a third time, and after 3 times, then it's considered kosher now. If you only put in water once, even though it sat for 3 days, that would not kosherize this bucket or this storage container. Now, let's say that, again, you have these storage containers that are meant to store wine for at least 3 days, and wine was left in there not just for a short time, it was left in there for over 24 hours. Now, we already saw earlier in the last chapter that in order for something to fully transfer taste from food into utensil, from one food to the next food, there needs to be some sort of heat medium. They have to be heated up together for taste to transfer back and forth. There's another way to affect taste transfer, non-kosher, again, getting concerned that there might be non-kosher flavors in something that would otherwise might be kosher. And that's if you have non-kosher juice, let's say non-kosher, some sort of meat juice from a non-kosher animal that's sitting in a pot or a cup or a bowl for 24 hours, even though no heat was applied. Once there for 24 hours, we assume that some flavors got into the walls of this utensil, and that utensil would need kosherizing even though no heat was ever applied. So back to our case where you have a storage container, something that's meant to store wine for at least 3 days, and you had a wine in there, not necessarily for 3 days, but over 24 hours. Now we're concerned that the flavors fully went into the walls as if heat was applied to it, and therefore require a full kosherizing, which means you have to clean it all out. You then have to put it into a pot of boiling water to get out any flavors that might be in the walls of this bowl, cup, pot, etc. What are the details of this Hagala process, kosherizing process? We're going to go through it a few months down the road when we get to chapter 116. Then we'll go through all the rules and different ways of kosherizing different types of utensils. Paragraph 18. An exception to last paragraph is glass utensils. If you have some sort of glass bowl or glass storage container, even if it's meant to hold the wine for 3 days, since glass is so smooth, then if you had wine in there for even for more than 24 hours, all you have to do is rinse it out 3 times. You don't have to do the Hagala process of putting it into a pot of boiling water in order to kosherize it. Doing the 3 24-hour soaking, that's enough to kosherize it. Now, of course, you have to make sure that's fully clean beforehand. So let's say some sort of pitcher which has a very thin neck, you got to make sure to scrub down there to get any sediment, any wine residue out of there before beginning that process. Paragraph 19. This is getting even more technical than what we've been doing until now. Let's say you have some sort of utensil that had kosher wine in it, and you poured out that wine, but there's still some residual moisture on the wall of the utensil. And it's moist enough that if something would touch that moisture, that thing can now make something else moist. So if a non-Jew touched that initial moisture that's inside the utensil, then you have to kosherize the utensil, but you could do the three rinsing method that we discussed earlier. Paragraph 20. Anytime we said use this method, this triple rinsing method of kosherizing these utensils, that of course is where everything was cold. If there was heat involved, if you had wine in a pot and the pot got heated up, or any utensil, any pitcher or thing, and there was heat applied to it, then that scenario, then you have to do a proper Hagala, proper kosherizing through boiling water, etc. Because at that point, once heat is applied to it, then we assume that flavors got fully into the container, and in order to get out those flavors that are fully embedded in the container, it has to undergo that Hagala process of being put into boiling water. Paragraph 21. If somebody owns a wine plant and a non-Jew touched the wine that was in the wine press or something of that sort, and that wine sat there for any amount of time at all, then make sure to speak to a highly qualified halachic authority, not just somebody that knows the halacha, but somebody that also understands the technology and of the system in order to know how to kosherize that wine plant, the wine vats, etc. Paragraph 22. Let's say you buy a wine glass or a wine set, some sort of set from a non-Jew that you want to use. So you have two ways of dealing with it. It had non-kosher wine in it, so it would have to be kosherized. But if it sat for 12 months without any wine in it, even if you had water in it, but as long as it sat 12 months since it was last used by the non-kosher wine, then at that point you assume that any wine moisture that's left within this cup, within this utensil, any wine moisture left in there would have evaporated, dissipated, and this utensil is now kosher even without undergoing a specific kosherizing process.